Art of the Italian Renaissance, Lecture 10. The apogee of the visual arts occurred from about 1495 to 1527. This is the High Renaissance. Its centers were Florence, Rome, and Venice. Its three giants were Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael, whose formative years will be the subject of Lectures 10 and 11. This excludes the stars of the Venetian Renaissance Giorgione and Titian, whom we will discuss in Lecture 13. By this time, the Renaissance style was quickly spreading throughout Italy, as we shall see. Dating is less straightforward. It is generally agreed that the High Renaissance began sometime in the 1490s, although 1500 has been proposed as a late cutoff for the start. The stylistic movement may end as early as 1520. However, Bertrand Russell and other scholars have proposed an ending date of 1527, when the Spanish troops marched into and sacked Rome. This date roughly coincides with the onset of Mannerism. Over the last 20 years or so, use of the term has been frequently criticized by academic art historians for oversimplifying artistic developments, ignoring historical context, and focusing only on a few iconic works. However, while you may problematize the label, it still makes sense for our purposes. The map of Italy is never really fixed until the late 19th century. But there are a few changes worth noting as we move from the early to High Renaissance. Before mentioning those, we might take a look at Italy's leaders, as Renaissance works are, more than ever, connected to place and patronage. First, Venice, which is really entering its heyday, gained some Milanese territory in the west. Milan, in its slightly smaller state, is ruled by Ludovico Sforza for 5 years before falling under French rule from 1499 to 1512. Milan briefly returned to Sforza rule from 1512 to 15 before the French crown repossessed it. Ultimately, in 1525 it was added to the vast Austrian Habsburg Empire of Charles V, who also held the title of King of Spain. Likewise, Naples was also briefly taken by the French, but then reverted to the Spanish crown. If you shift your attention to Rome, the popes became more militant and directly acquired territory stretching up to Bologna. Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander Borgia, and Pope Julius are major figures. Taking a closer look at the map, we might introduce ourselves to the High Renaissance works we will study, although we will certainly return to these places in more detail. First of all, in central Italy, the Florentine Renaissance had an initial crisis after the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent in 1492, but then it remained one of the Renaissance centers after 1500, as the government oscillated between Republic and de' Medici Signoria. Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael made important stays in Florence, and around 1504 all three of the great masters were in Florence at the same time. Michelangelo's David, a commission of the Florentine Republic, is probably the most important work to emerge from this time. Other artists of the High Renaissance include Fra Bartolomeo and Andrea del Sarto. Michelangelo also did some important early works in Bologna, in about 1494 to 95. In northern Italy, Ludovico Sforza provided patronage for Leonardo da Vinci, who arguably opened the High Renaissance with his painting of the Last Supper there from 1494 to 99. He left a school of painters who worked in his style, including Luini, Solario, and Boltraffio. Bramante, an architect from Urbino, brought the High Renaissance to Milan. Mantua was still ruled by the Gonzaga family. More important than Francesco II was his wife Isabella d'Este of Ferrara, who was among the greatest patrons of the High Renaissance. We will be looking at one of Mantegna's later works executed for her studiolo from about 1497 to 1502. Lorenzo Costa of the Ferrarese school worked prominently in Mantua as well. Titian was there in the 1500s. Parma was a city within the Milanese territory at this time, but tied historically to the cultural geographical region of Emilia. Parmigianino, who is named for the city, began his work there at this time, while Correggio, who was formed in Modena, created his masterpieces in Parma starting in the early 1520s. Ferrara, where the Este family continued their long rule, had its own school of painters, including Lorenzo Costa, who also worked in Mantua, and Dosso Dossi, a bit later in this period. Ercole d'Este, who ruled till 1505, was the father of the aforementioned Isabella d'Este and Beatrice d'Este, who was the wife of Ludovico Sforza in Milan. Urbino had a magnificent court. The Montefeltro Duke Guidobaldo, who succeeded his father Federico, was married to a Gonzaga princess, Elisabetta. Raphael, whose childhood years were spent in Urbino, painted their portraits in 1506. The refined court provided the model for Baldassarre's ideal courtier, the subject of his popular publication Il Cortegiano. Raphael actually trained primarily in Perugia, in Umbria, under Perugino, who was still producing works there. Pinturicchio, who executed major works in Rome just before the arrival of Michelangelo and Raphael, was also formed in Perugia and continued to execute works there and other Umbrian towns. He also worked in Siena. In Rome, the popes were very much secular political leaders as well as spiritual ones, and as noted, they could be rather militant in their territorial acquisitions that added to the papal states. Alexander Borgia, Julius II of the Della Rovere family, Leo X, a Medici, and Clement VII, another Medici, were also important patrons, making Rome the most important city of the High Renaissance. It was there that Bramante designed his Tempietto, that Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling and sculpted his Pietà, among other works, and that Raphael created the extensive decorative program in the papal apartments. Andrea del Sarto worked in Rome as well. Finally, back in North Italy, the Venetian Republic was, with Florence and Rome, the third center of the High Renaissance. Giovanni Bellini was still creating works in this period. Palma il Vecchio was an important artist at the outset of the period. Giorgione was the first Venetian star, but he had a short life, and few works that can be solidly attributed to him survive. Titian, the other superstar, had a long life, but he was creating masterpieces as early as the 1510s and 20s. Now that our preliminary tour of Italian High Renaissance geography is complete, let's take a look at some of these artists and their works in more detail. I've discussed some of Leonardo da Vinci's early portraits already. One of his early masterpieces is the Virgin of the Rocks, painted sometime between 1483 and 1490, and arguably an early outlier of the High Renaissance. This was created shortly after Leonardo's arrival in Milan, where he sought a position in the court of Ludovico Sforza, who was regent for his young nephew. The painting was designed as an altarpiece, commissioned by the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception for the Church of San Francesco Grande in Milan. It was actually the central panel of a triptych, whose smaller flanking panels were executed by other artists. You are looking at the version of the painting housed in the Louvre in Paris, but there are actually two versions of the work. Leonardo wanted more money for the painting than what the confraternity wanted to pay when the work was completed, and a legal battle ensued. Strangely, rather than handing over the original work in the end, Leonardo helped produce an approximate copy of the work in 1508. What we're viewing is a picture of the Virgin Mary, the Madonna, with baby Jesus, baby Saint John the Baptist, and an angel in an outdoor setting. Can you correctly identify John and Jesus? The child that Mary wraps her arm around is not her own son, but rather Saint John the Baptist, who looks towards the baby Jesus closest to the viewer in the foreground. There is a significant play of gestures in this painting, and while we've seen hand gestures rhythmically guiding us through compositions before, helping to narrate the story, these gestures are contained within a small space that leads our attention from one figure to another. Mary's protective gesture over Jesus' head. This is interrupted by the angel's pointing gesture, directing us to St. John. Mary's embracing gesture, leading us to St. John as well, but ultimately around through his arms back to Jesus, where his praying hands direct us as well. Finally, Jesus' gesture of blessing, directed at John. The gazes reinforce these visual paths, and the angel invites the viewer directly into this pleasing visual trap where we get stuck bouncing from figure to figure. The warm glow on the flesh of the figures' faces and bodies is also concentrated in this central area. The subject of the infant St. John adoring the infant Christ in the presence of the Virgin and an angel has no immediate precedent, and is thus typical of Leonardo's inventiveness and true quest for original aesthetic approaches, as well as new ways of looking at nature. The grotto setting, which is hazy and mysterious, is another example of this. Some scholars have proposed that the primordial landscape may symbolically allude to the new doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, which is the virgin birth of Mary. That's to say, not only did Mary give birth to Jesus as a virgin, but the same thing happened with her mother, making Mary entirely pure, since sex is inherently sinful. While others have read the natural elements, the mix of cavernous-like spaces and the water, as well as the plant life, as symbols of maternity, referencing Mary's role as the mother of Christ. One of the most notable stylistic elements is the sense of atmosphere in this painting. This is an early but consummate use of Leonardo's so-called sfumato technique. Sfumato means that the edges are softened through the use of blurred contours and the use of transparent glazes of light and shadow, which are laid uniformly across various elements of the composition. This blurring and blending creates an effect of atmosphere by unifying figures into a cohesive space with each other and their surroundings. This is the exact opposite of Botticelli, who actually put down contour lines to define edges of spaces. Leonardo's atmospheric quality creates a kind of warmth and intimacy, as well as a kind of poetry. This is reinforced by the figure's quiet, serene, absorptive, almost otherworldly expressions set in faces that are, of course, highly naturalistic. Light and shadow in the modeling of the figures, as well as the contrast between light bodies and shadowy backgrounds, certainly adds to the sense of space. However, the arrangement of figures is inherently three-dimensional as well, the way they are arranged in a loose pyramidal structure rather than in a shallow plane. Leonardo created another work in Milan that some scholars have considered to be the first classic statement of the ideals of the High Renaissance. This is The Last Supper, commissioned as a mural for the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan and dating to about 1495 to 1498. The dining hall contained other murals on the room's other walls, and these celebrated the Sforza family as much as the holiest stories of Christianity. This mural represents Christ's last shared meal with his disciples before his arrest and crucifixion, and the drama of the moment clearly alludes to Christ's revelation at the meal that one of his disciples would betray him. It turns out that the betrayer is Judas, and this figure is usually distinguished in some way, as we've seen in earlier examples. Often he's the lone figure placed on the near side of the table. But before identifying Judas here, we should talk about the composition. It is a long-standing Florentine convention that the subject was represented with all figures except Judas lined up on the far side of the table. This is obviously a conceit to legibility and clarity of the image, and for this reason, even though it's not perhaps the most realistic or viable way for a group of 13 people to dine together, Leonardo kept it. It allowed for a highly organized, incisive composition that deserves a more in-depth analysis. However, I'd like to save that for our class discussions, so please look closely at the formal elements and consider how Leonardo exploited these to impart the messages he wished to about the characters in this moment. We'll definitely discuss it. What the staged quality of this setup lacks in naturalism, the figures themselves make up for. Each of the disciples has been depicted in a highly individualized way. With regard to their general appearance and their expression and gestures, they seem to be reacting to Christ's announcement that one of the disciples will betray him. At the same time, however, Jesus' own gestures anticipate the miracle of the Eucharist. He seems to be drawing attention to the bread, which he broke before saying, "This is my body, which is given to you. Do this in remembrance of me." For Catholics, as the Italian Renaissance Christians were, the ceremony, called communion, is recreated in Mass when the priest transubstantiates bread and wine literally into the body and blood of Christ for the congregation to consume, thus allowing them to remember Jesus' sacrifice in the story of the crucifixion and resurrection. I should mention that this figure to Jesus' right, our left, was interpreted as a secret depiction of Mary Magdalene by the fiction writer Dan Brown. Although it's popular culture, not scholarship, I'd simply like to point out the obvious. First, that the beloved disciple is always shown in this state of lassitude, and it shouldn't be mistaken for something feminine. Second, the beloved disciple is traditionally depicted as a particularly young man, and Leonardo had a habit of depicting young men in a somewhat androgynous way, with long hair, which was still a fashion of the Quattrocento, by the way. You probably noticed the bad state of preservation of this work, and that's because Leonardo used an experimental technique. He did not want to work in fresco, because only an oil-based medium would allow for the atmospheric effects that had come to characterize his work. The oil unfortunately did not stick, and its deterioration incited the monks to cut a door into the mural, and then prompted a restoration as early as the 18th century. The work has been restored more recently, but little is left from Leonardo's hand, besides the design. What else was Leonardo up to in Milan, by the way? You may not realize this, but Leonardo's primary work was not as a painter. To get what we might consider full-time work, possible almost exclusively in a courtly setting, artists had to serve more as artistic directors than what we might think of as just an artist in the more modern manner of a Claude Monet or Georgia O'Keeffe, and much of their work was ephemeral. He designed banquet decorations, organized tournaments, invented emblems and heraldic devices, and even staged plays and composed fables. He served as an engineer, and, as exemplified by the drawings he made in his sketchbook, took a personal interest in the natural sciences, as well as invention. His drawings indicate that he studied the natural world almost like a botanist, geologist, or biologist. His anatomical drawings are particularly well known and celebrated, including this one of a fetus in the uterus. Leonardo's drawings show a particularly pointed interest in movement and expressivity. Dynamism is a recurring theme in his work, whether he's trying to capture the movement of water or explain the mechanical movements of a body, human or otherwise, or an invention, or simply show beings in action. Likewise, facial expressions in pose or gesture are vital for representing the world with greater naturalism. But he is no slave to naturalism, as sketches of caricature-like grotesque heads, imaginative allegorical figures, and mythological creatures indicate. His imagination also led him to try to invent all kinds of machines and devices that wouldn't be fully realized until modern times, such as a flying apparatus or underwater diving suit. The iconic Vitruvian Man is Leonardo's answer to the ancient description of the ideal proportions of the human body outlined by Vitruvius. Vitruvius' sketch did not survive, just the idea that the ideal body fit into both a square and a circle. The drawing exemplifies the artistic interest in a mathematical system of proportions during the Renaissance, and in a broader sense, the relationship of math to the natural world, where humans not only represent a glorious example of natural creation, but also serve, through their reason, as a conduit for identifying, understanding, and to some degree, dominating the natural world. It might be interesting to consider Leonardo as a man at this time. A fascinating figure, he was the archetype of what has been called the Renaissance man, which is essentially a polymath, or a person who is well educated in a variety of subjects including arts, letters, and sciences. Famously left-handed, he wrote in mirror image from right to left. He was a vegetarian for ethical reasons and loved animals. Apparently he was a very attractive and graceful man, who could be seen about town dressed in stylish clothes and surrounded by an entourage of attractive young men. He took care of his long hair and eventually let his beard grow as well. Leonardo was accused of sodomy, as homosexual acts were called, in 1476 at the age of 24, at a time when sexual acts between two men could be punished with the death penalty. However, there was insufficient proof for a conviction. Despite this, he maintained long-term relationships with two of his pupils. Leonardo was rather self-conscious about appearing cultivated as well, and he had refined habits. Michelangelo Buonarroti, though a man of great pride, was the exact opposite, although, coincidentally, he was apparently also a homosexual man who came to be considered one of the great geniuses in the history of art. Michelangelo was fairly well educated. His interests were perhaps a bit less expansive than Leonardo's, but he was as famous for his painted works as his sculpted ones, and his architectural achievements are important as well. Michelangelo considered himself a sculptor, not a painter, despite being constantly pulled into painting commissions, and this very interest highlights a difference between him and Leonardo. Leonardo considered painting to be the more refined art because the work of the sculptor, which included chipping away at marble, required physical exertion and resulted in a dusty mess. Michelangelo was a gruff and unkempt person who cared little for his appearance or, to some degree, for his manners. He was a different kind of genius than Leonardo. He was more like the romantic version of the artist as a tortured soul, although this was expressed in his poetry, which remains renowned among his contemporaries. Michelangelo Buonarroti was born in 1475, the second of 5 sons to what we might consider a white-collar family that was passing through a period of economic hardship. Michelangelo lost his mother at the age of 7 and would help support his father and brothers throughout his life. He was apprenticed to Domenico Ghirlandaio, and since pupils often assisted their masters in large fresco projects, he may have painted parts of the Bologna chapel that we briefly looked at. He began to frequent the Garden of San Marco, a sort of artistic academy supported by Lorenzo the Magnificent. The quality of his work, even as an adolescent, brought him to the personal attention of Lorenzo, who invited him to reside in his palazzo. There, Michelangelo met the Neoplatonists Poliziano, Marsilio Ficino, and Pico della Mirandola. He also met some future Medici patrons, including Lorenzo's son Giovanni, the future Pope Leo X, and his nephew Giulio, future Pope Clement VII. To these formative years date the Madonna of the Stairs, about 1491, a low-relief sacred subject in the style of Donatello, and the Battle of the Centaurs, dating to about 1491 to 92, a profane high-relief subject possibly proposed by Poliziano and influenced in style by those later Quattrocento artists referring to antique Roman sarcophagi. Michelangelo's biography is inextricably tied to the history of Florence, which passed through a period of upheaval before Michelangelo even reached the age of 20. First of all, Lorenzo de' Medici died in 1492. His son, Piero de' Medici, then held power for 2 years, until 1494. This was all at the time when the fanatic Dominican monk Girolamo Savonarola came on the scene preaching hellfire and doomsday. The Medici reign came to an end when the French invaded in 1494, and the Florentines returned to the Republic from 1494 to 1512. Of course, republics rarely fare well in history when a noble family has taken a strong foothold, and after that 18-year interlude, The Medici would return to power from 1512 to 27, and after a few more bumps, continued to rule for the next 200 years. One of Savonarola's most notorious acts was urging the Florentines to hold a bonfire of the vanities. The so-called vanities were any objects that could be construed as sinful for encouraging humans to gravitate towards the materialistic and thus move away from the spiritual, and included profane books, poetry, and irreplaceable artwork, as well as musical instruments, mirrors, cosmetics, luxurious dresses, jewelry, and playing cards. Artists such as Botticelli, Fra Bartolomeo, and Lorenzo di Credi were enticed to destroy their own works, ranging from nude drawings to mythological paintings. Antique statues were thrown onto the fire as well. Savonarola's team of ardent supporters hounded anyone who tried to object, and either shamed or harassed them into consigning objects to the bonfire. But Savonarola overreached his hand when he criticized the lack of piety and humility among high-ranking members of the Church. Pope Alexander VI, Borgia, was not having it. He excommunicated the fanatic monk, charged him with heresy and sedition, and ordered his execution in May 1498. Savonarola was burned at the stake in the Piazza della Signoria, thus causing him to perish in the same way as those objects that he had consigned to destruction. Needless to say, these were not the best years for art making in Florence, and Michelangelo was absent during much of this time. In 1494 he left Florence for the first time and headed to Bologna, where he came under the protection of Giovan Francesco Aldovrandini, a nobleman close to the ruling Bentivoglio family. He worked on the Arca di San Domenico, a monument containing the remains of Saint Dominic, begun several centuries earlier by Nicola Pisano. Michelangelo contributed a statue of Saint Proclus and a kneeling angel, and also finished a Saint Petronius started earlier by Niccolò dell'Arca. The solidity and innovative vigor of these early works already distinguish him from his Quattrocento predecessors, and Michelangelo's famous Terribilità appears in the fierce expression of Saint Proclus, a kind of precursor to the David. The stay in Bologna was important for Michelangelo's artistic development, as he was exposed to Jacopo della Quercia's reliefs for San Petronio. You can clearly see the difference in approach between Michelangelo and his contemporaries by comparing the angel by Niccolò dell'Arca on the left and the angel by Michelangelo on the right. Niccolò's work still retains much of the typical elegance of the International Gothic. There is a simplification that involves the reduction of forms. The lithe angel rests a slender candelabra on his knee without any effort, and though he supports himself, doesn't seem to have much substance. Michelangelo, on the other hand, presents a robust figure with a thick candelabra that engages the angel's muscles and the bulk of his body. While Niccolò's angel has a plausible pose, the pose of Michelangelo's angel requires a much deeper understanding of anatomy and how the body works as a system in response to the force of gravity and the weight of objects. The drapery does not hang in simplified lines and curves. Instead, Michelangelo has cinched the robe at the waist and allowed for much more complex folds that, overall, reveal much more of the rather meaty body underneath. Back in Florence, a junior branch of the Medici family, led by the great artistic patron Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco, had entered the political scene. Although the new republic was dominated culturally by Savonarola's preaching, Pierfrancesco commissioned a sleeping Cupid from Michelangelo, and it is this work that eventually paved the sculptor's way to Rome, in a rather roundabout way. Instead of keeping the statue, Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco encouraged Michelangelo to make it appear to have been buried in the earth and pass it off as an ancient statue. It is under these pretenses that he sold it to a dealer, who in turn sold it to Cardinal Riario, nephew of Pope Sixtus IV and one of the richest collectors of the time. The cardinal learned of the deception and apparently demanded a refund in his fury. However, after determining who the artist was, the cardinal was so impressed by his talent that he ended up inviting him to Rome. The Cupid eventually made its way to the collection of Isabella d'Este in Mantua, whom we shall encounter shortly. Michelangelo arrived in Rome in 1496, and there created a statue of astounding originality. Apparently commissioned by Riario, it was perhaps refused by the cardinal, as it ended up in the sculpture garden of the cardinal's banker, Jacopo Galli, with whom Michelangelo was residing. In any case, the contact with Riario was important, as it gave Michelangelo access to his impressive collection and to his culture. The work in question, a Bacchus, sculpted in 1497, has no equivalent in the art of its time. A nude rendering of the pagan god of wine, Bacchus, it represents, in the shadow of the Pope in Rome, the exact type of sinful work that Savonarola in Florence was not only preventing artists from undertaking, but also actively encouraging them to destroy. Michelangelo's Bacchus shows the impact of classical statuary, not only in subject but also through the naturalistic representation of the body, which, furthermore, is rather sensual. How would you describe Bacchus's state? He is clearly inebriated. His lolling body is also off-kilter, and he not only tilts his belly forward but also tilts from side to side, as if trying to regain his balance. It's like a sloppy, intoxicated contrapposto. He manages to clumsily hold up his cup of wine, a typical drunken gesture. His head slumps forward as he struggles to maintain his equilibrium, but his glazed eyes look upwards, his mouth hangs open. The statue very much invites a fully three-dimensional perusal, and this is not just due to the off-center pose. There is a secondary figure crouching behind the god. This is a little faun, with goat legs and long pointy ears. He's mischievously stealing a bunch of grapes. Unheard of for the time was the expressivity and the elasticity of the forms. The gratuitous nudity in a pagan subject is not exactly commonplace either. This is actually one of Michelangelo's few finished works, for he started many, but for various reasons rarely brought his later sculptures to completion. It indicates his arrival at a mature style, even at such a young age. Michelangelo created one of his most renowned masterpieces in these years in Rome as well, 1497 to 1499. It established his fame as a sculptor before he was even 25 years old. The Pietà was commissioned by the French Cardinal Jean de Villers de la Grolée, ambassador for the invading Charles VIII at the court of Pope Alexander VI, Borgia. This is Michelangelo's first work in Carrara marble. His lifelong preference and his personal selection of the marble indicates a connoisseur's appreciation of his medium. He brought important innovations to a northern iconographic tradition in which a mourning Mary holds the body of the dead Christ, her son. This iconography, known as a Vesper build in the north, had been rare in Italy, notably the pyramidal composition with the cradled body. In comparing these two images, you might notice that Michelangelo rejected polychrome. Most medieval statues had been painted, but Renaissance artists were emulating the bare white marble statues from antiquity. Or so they thought. Most antique marble statues had been painted as well during their time, but the surface paint was not preserved, even as the solid underlying stone defied erosion. You might also notice how oddly youthful Mary looks. Dante referred to her as Vergine Madre Figlia di tuo figlio, daughter of your son. Michelangelo's own comments confirm that a virgin, a pure and unused woman, should appear in a perfect state, that's to say, one of immortal, youthful beauty. How is it that the Virgin convincingly carries the weight of her dead son's body on her lap? It is really the drapery that gives her the massiveness necessary to support that weight. Once students notice them, they kind of get stuck on this idea of non-naturalistic, exaggerated proportions. I always say, at least with sculpture, it's a different viewing experience in person because it is a 3D object and thus susceptible to changes in light, changes in the viewer's position, etc. However, while it's fair to say the same exaggeration might be noticed in person, it's also fair to say that it might be overlooked, which was really Michelangelo's aim. In fact, However well you estimate this solution, you should know that the intention was for the drapery to act as a kind of camouflage for the fact that she certainly couldn't support the body with such ease. And Christ has a very convincing sense of weight and lifelessness, with a highly naturalistic and beautifully rendered anatomy, as well as a convincing pose. I usually ask students to look for the particular places where this quality is conveyed. You might also notice the organic curves of the composition to note the interconnectivity of the two bodies, which are also firmly fused, you might say, in this strong pyramidal shape, which, overall, creates a stable, balanced, harmonious, and graceful work of art. Mary betrays no strong signs of emotion, but her grief is inherently manifest in the image as a whole. The more expressive gesture of Mary's left hand invites the spectator to meditate on the tragic representation of the dead Christ. There is a minimal suggestion of setting. The rocky base symbolizes the summit of Mount Calvary, the site of Jesus' crucifixion. The surface finish is so meticulous that the marble has translucent qualities evoking soft wax. I'm not a sculptor, but I can't imagine these intricate areas of carving, especially around Mary's veil, require anything less than an exceptional talent. I had mentioned that this work established Michelangelo's fame, and with that I have an amusing story reported to us by Vasari. Shortly after its completion, Michelangelo went to see the sculpture in place, and there found a crowd of people from Lombardy who were praising the work highly and wondering who had made it. One viewer said that it must surely have been made by one of the renowned sculptors of their own region, a certain Galbo. Michelangelo, desirous to have this work attributed to him and no one else, supposedly returned to the work at night, with his chisels in hand, and carved his name across the Virgin's sash, Michelangelo Buonarroti of Florence. The story continues in our next lecture, where we'll look at the early years of Raphael and the confluence of the three geniuses of the High Renaissance, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael, in Florence.